Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to Late Night Learning. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Palomba. Now, today we're going to be talking about communication in organizations. This is a little bit different than our previous lecture on processes of persuasion. And so we've gone over cognitive dissonance theory, we've gone over inoculation theory. There will be no needles in this lecture either. And we've talked about ways in which that we can persuade people, right? Bringing up counter arguments, anticipating counter arguments, and then giving a rebuttal, giving a response to a counter argument that we're met. As we know with cognitive dissonance, some people aren't necessarily thrilled with information that opposes their viewpoints. We also know from the elaboration likelihood model, people tend to process information either at a high elaboration level or a low elaboration level, resulting in the ways in which that we process information. Differently, we also have inoculation theory, the idea that we can kind of provide people a conceptual baseline before other information is presented to them, rendering them inoculated or resistant to some sort of counter information. So with this lecture, we're going to look a little bit past that, and we're going to be going into communication and corporate culture. This is somewhat related to persuasion because ultimately the way in which a corporation culture works, emerges, or is organized is very much indicative of how they communicate to other people and how they really think of themselves. So let's go to the next slide. So communication in organizations. What does it mean to make sense of things? We are very much interested in making sense of everything. I am currently in a TV studio. I am currently surrounded by cameras, lights, everything that are facing me. So I must be important at this moment because I'm being recorded, right? I can kind of observe a lot of different things based on my own environment. That's a very, very primal, primitive way of looking at the world, but it's what we do as human beings. We try to make complex environments meaningful. There are also chairs in the studio that are not being used. I suspect they are not being used because I don't have guests here, and it's really not part of what I do here. And so all of these conclusions are being drawn when I enter the room. When we enter a workspace, any kind of location, we try to make meaning out of it. And so the social world itself is enacted or brought into being through equivocality reducing communication. So this also occurs in a retrospective manner. We assign meaning to events or interactions afterwards to make sense of them. So that's kind of what equivocality reducing communication gets at. This notion that we may assign meaning to events later on, after they have been transpired or after they have transpired. Variation refers to the changes and aspects of an environment that require our attention. If an idea or behavior has equivocality, then it has more than one possible and plausible meaning. And so we move away from equivocality reducing communication to then really thinking about all the different explanations that may be in front of us. Now, this might happen too when we're looking at an organization. It could be something like IHOP. IHOP recently announced they're going to start calling themselves kind of a burger restaurant. And so they want to move away from pancakes into burgers. From that kind of communication, we can kind of assume a few things. Maybe burgers are more profitable. Maybe they're trying to expand lunch into dinner. Maybe they want people to stop thinking of them as only a breakfast-only place. That's a wide array of explanations for that particular behavior. So when we're looking at communication in an organization, at a firm, a company, or whatever, it's really important to think about many, many different reasons for something occurring and the kinds of meaning that might be distilled from the particular communication disseminated from a company. Let's move along. Culture and communication. I love Disneyland, but unfortunately, there's a bit of bad news with this particular slide. So members create culture, a sense of place. If you really, really love the University of Florida, as do I, if you really love Syracuse University, as do I, management, executives, professors have a lot to do with the culture there, but ultimately the members create the sense of being. You know, we can go to Disneyland, we can go to Disney World, we can go to a beach, and we can create our own memories. But that's the key there. We're making the memories. We create meaning. We create culture. We create sense of place. And so organizational cultures are dynamic and change over time because of the kinds of people they may hire, get rid of, or who may leave. So it's fragmented in nature. Now, cultures also carry emotionally charged meanings. And so the kind of culture that we have in the United States, we just celebrated the 4th of July, we carry an emblematic flag that is indicative of freedom. That we have freedom of speech, freedom of religion. We have a lot of different freedoms here. Those are emotionally charged in nature, and we've had many, many soldiers die for that particular cause. And so, similarly, organizations provide a foreground and a background of organizational life, fully aware that cultures can carry emotionally charged meanings. After all, humans are emotionally charged. We do not operate as robots. An instance in which culture within an organization may run askew or run awry or may not be doing so hot is currently, as of this programming, Disneyland out in LA is under fire for not paying workers livable wages. And so how might this impact workplace culture? Some people who are working the rides at Disneyland may not want to work the rides anymore. Disney Magic is something that is very much prevalent at both parks. I've had the good fortune of being at both. But when you have a workplace culture communication issue like this, the issue being that this is now in newspapers, this is now on blogs, that Disneyland is having an issue with paying workers a livable wage, you run into issues if you're Disney's public relations department. How do you spin this? How do you deal with it? Do you spin this? Do you try to meet the workers halfway? What do you do in a workplace when you're thinking about this? Because it's not just trying to treat your employees fairly, it's also the communication that goes beyond your employees, right? If this story is in the New York Times or the LA Times, you've got millions of readers who might be not really hot on going to Disneyland, or might not be hot on going to Disney World, or might not be hot on seeing a Disney film, right? That kind of information, that little news clipping, that little piece of news can really have a lot of damage, and it can erode Disney's brand temporarily or cause it great pain, especially from a brand perspective. And so it's really crucial to think about, when you're in an organization, the kind of public relations that is going on and how the company is represented, as well as the relationship and the communication between upper management, lower management, and employees, and the rest of the employees. It's really, really crucial to think about these things. They can have dire consequences that can take a long time to fix. Let's move along. Multiple stakeholder model breakdown. So stakeholders are people that have a stake in something. Stakeholder model has been long embraced by a lot of different firms. We have stakeholders at Disney. We have investors at IBM. We have a lot of different people who have invested interests in the well-being of a company. And so someone who has a stake or an interest in an organization's decision-making here is a stakeholder. And usually if you're a huge investor in a company, you have 10%, 20% of the stocks or shares, you may be called upon to give your opinion because after all, you own a huge chunk of the company. Coordination is also imperative here, as creating organizational spaces and practices is a tall order. So the kind of practices an organization may have need to be implemented and carried out. For instance, Starbucks, the popular coffee chain, is very big on giving its employees stockholder options. Yes, in fact, if you go to Starbucks, you too can have stocks in the company. And so coordinating this particular organizational practice is a tall order. It is important when you have people with a stake in something to have coordination. If you want to keep attracting top talent, be it baristas, be it executives, be it managers at Starbucks, this is a corporate organizational policy you need to maintain. And then, of course, we have outcomes. So through participatory decision-making, organizations can become sites where diverse stakeholders negotiate meaningful and satisfying outcomes. And that's what we do from an organizational perspective. It is crucial that when you're in a corporate entity, that you're communicating effectively about the different corporate policies that you have. and the different kinds of stakeholders you may have. If you're a mom and pop shop and you don't have any investors, the communication can kind of be in-house, right? It can be internal. Differently though, if your company is publicly traded, that means you're probably on some sort of stock index. That means that other people can buy shares. That also means a lot of your company's transgressions, decision-making, and communication are out there in the public sphere because it is incumbent upon you to provide investors with a holistic picture of what's going on in your company. So it's really important when we think of multiple stakeholders to maintain communication. And you can see how persuasion really factors in here a lot, because if you're trying to persuade someone that a corporate policy is still enacted, or that a company is still upholding sexual harassment policies, or a company is still upholding some sort of policy, you want to be persuasive to journalists. You know, Uber and Lyft have been accused of some indiscretions, one of which was sexual harassment. And so for those companies, they need to maintain a really good public relations outreach, right? They need to be honest and upfront with journalists. Their communication has to be clear and crisp and sharp. Everybody has to understand how they're fixing the situation, what they're doing about it. The Weinstein Company, which has gone through a very tumultuous year since Harvey Weinstein was accused and pretty much found to have sexually harassed dozens of actresses and directors and producers, unfortunately, in his career, they have had to be very outspoken and upfront about what went on, really to protect the sanctity and the perception of consumers surrounding the company. Any kind of company foible, any kind of company issue, you can see very quickly how the company believes in their own corporate culture by how quickly they react to something. If there's an issue and they bite it in the bud immediately, it's something that's near and dear to them. A few months ago from this airing at Starbucks, there were two African-American gentlemen that were kicked out of Starbucks. I believe there was a Caucasian manager. I believe she called 911 because the two African-American gentlemen wouldn't leave. Even though they weren't causing an issue, they weren't causing a ruckus or anything like that. As a result, Starbucks stepped in, and I believe it was a month later, they closed all of their stores for 3 hours for mandatory diversity training. Now that's an excellent piece, not only multiple stakeholder model, just coordinating a company policy on tolerance, but also being upfront with people. And so you can quickly see with public relations how much it's important to be clear and crisp in your communications. If Starbucks waited on that, if they said, yeah, it's just a one instance and it really doesn't mean much, that might have drawn the ire and fury of some other parties. And so the way in which Starbucks responded to this was appropriate, it was timely, it was quick, it was fast, and it saved them a lot of headaches. And they were very, very adept at bringing this to the forefront, to highlighting this in newspapers, and then highlighting their diversity day across all of the stores as, a first step in really implementing strong diversity practices within all Starbucks coffee shops. Let's move along. So finally, multiple stakeholders' position is part of this, and it investigates ways to get out of corporate controlled cultures through a new way of conceiving and practicing organizational communication. So really what this gets at is that multiple stakeholders' position, the idea of this model, the idea of this notion of having stakeholders, of having coordinated communication, and then outcomes is that we need widespread participation in society because diverse group participation in corporate decision making will lead to better decisions. And so currently, for instance, Nintendo has typically hired a lot of Japanese executives. It makes sense. Nintendo is a Japanese company. But they began hiring Americans and many different ethnicities within their culture to make it more diverse. Regis Fils-Aimé, I believe I'm saying his name right, is the marketing head at Nintendo of America, and actually somebody I personally admire. He is a Latino, and he is now at a very high level within Nintendo. He brings a fresh perspective to the table with any kind of corporate decision making. And so it has been found in academic study after academic study companies that have males and females, African Americans, Caucasians, Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans, companies that are super diverse really are able to exploit and capitalize on sound decision making. When people come into a room possessing different ethnicities, possessing different genders, they come inherently with different perspectives. A female Latino, whether she is rich, whether she is poor, whether she is from the United States, whether she's from El Salvador, for all of those things, she will inherently have a different perspective on really any issue that comes through the corporate boardroom than I will, as a Caucasian male who has grown up in New York and who has a middle class income. For all of those things, her and I working together is going to be tremendously useful in making sound and solid corporate decisions. So people can make good collaborative decisions if given the chance and forum. And that's really what this comes down to. And so when you're trying to erect sound communication in companies, if you're trying to create persuasive arguments for why we should create a Sonic the Hedgehog movie, which by the way is coming out a year from now, or if we should create a Super Mario Brothers movie, which has been rumored at Nintendo, when you have diverse people working at a company, you get to attack an idea from multiple perspectives, and the company inherently benefits. Let's move along. So if people are to make the high quality collaborative decisions that we've alluded to earlier in complex situations, they'll need better information and training. And so some companies are very adept at providing this for their employees. NBC Universal is a company that constantly trains its employees. Google, Facebook, these are also companies that invest in their employees. And so the understanding of communication that underlies most models of collaboration and joint decision making is misleading and leads to shortcoming. We need to engage in understanding antecedents of communication. Change is possible in a corporate culture, but in order to do that, as the paragraph alludes to, we need to engage in understanding why communication is the way that it is in a corporate culture. Are people siloed off? Do some executives not want to listen to people underneath them? Do some executives not embrace certain people of certain ethnicities or certain genders? Once we can begin to tap into this in any kind of corporation or firm, we can then ensure better communication within an organization. These are the underpinnings of a subject area entitled organizational communication. So much of what we've gone over so far is very much indicative of organization communication. How can we get an organization to communicate better within itself? Let's move along. So finally, in kind of wrapping all of this up, there are some examples in industry in which a lot of companies are really good about investing in employees and clearly communicating through these ventures that they are interested and invested. For instance, LL Bean, the clothing wear company, has one-on-one meetings with employees. Employee culture decks as well are given to employees for them to better understand the culture. Every employee is the most important ever in this company. It's kind of a nice thought. They just don't say it though. They actually act on it. They regularly check in with employees. It's not enough to communicate something. We also communicate by behavior. Think about working at LL Bean, getting a silly employee culture deck and saying, yeah, my manager doesn't meet with me. What is this about? And so because LL Bean also acts on it, it further reinforces this notion. Quora pairs the employees with new employees for mentorship. Quora is the kind of know-it-all, curious website in which there's a lot of information on to learn a whole host of things on. They link new employees with old employees for mentorship, which is incredibly useful when you're trying to start a new job. Starbucks employees, we love Starbucks employees, says Starbucks. How? Not only do they say it in PR addresses and on their websites, but they show their communication behavior through receiving stock options, and employees are also eligible for health care. Finally, and this is a photo from Facebook, Facebook plays to employees' strengths. So they always use self-assessments, they do exit interviews, they offer extended parental care, and offer employees lots of autonomy. And it challenges them to come up with solutions on their own in the job themselves. So employees at Facebook are required to sometimes come up with answers for some of those, obstacles they may face day to day. But from that, they feel empowered. Employees are able to kind of have a lot of autonomy. They don't really have a lot of people breathing down their backs, and so they're able to create and fail and explore. And so with all of these corporate culture examples that we have here, clearly companies are communicating that they're invested in their employees. It's not just enough to say that they're invested in it. And being that this is a communication theory lecture, it's not enough just to say something. You actually have to act on it. And with the communication theories that we've gone over today, you can quickly see how important it is to have coordinated communication within a company, how important it is to recognize stakeholders, people who either have invested in your company or may work for your company, how important it is to be transparent, and how important it is to have measurable outcomes that are communicated effectively for the particular company. When we have all of these things, and when we also have diversity in the boardroom, and when we're able to draw on multiple perspectives from a lot of different people, then we have an optimally running organization where communication is flowing, ideas are perfected and worked on and refined, and the corporate culture is clearly enshrined and upheld in the company itself. Well, that's all we have for Late Night Learning. As always, keep laughing and keep learning.